Hello, my name is Jordan, and today we're going to be talking about the reasons why you should never half-ass your wars. We are analyzing the Iran war, and this is my long way of explaining the conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran, and why the war is stopping, not because of a decisive surrender or defeat on the battlefield, but because both sides have slammed into rigid structural walls that has resulted in the 100+ day quagmire that you are seeing today. So, we are going to be talking about why the war is ending now instead of sooner or rather than later, or instead of pushing Iran towards an unconditional surrender. This is the brief overview that I will be addressing. I'm going to be talking about how a subservient Iran is a strategic impossibility based on decades of animosity. The asymmetric pain tolerance that Iran is able to absorb more than the United States. We are then going to talk about the collapsing global economic architecture and how in particular, energy and fertilizer crises would have brought us to the brink of not just a global depression, but a humanitarian catastrophe as well. Then we are going to talk about the hard ceiling of the actual war itself and how all three actors, Israel, the United States, and Iran, have quickly quagmired into this war. Lastly, we are going to review all of those points and bring up some more to determine whether or not peace will last. Uh, for some context, if you are unaware, there has been a draft of a 14-point plan that has been brought up by both Iran and the United States. So it is safe to say that the memorandum of understanding does appear to be real and true based on what Pakistani officials and other third-party groups have said. And for reference, I am recording this on the bright Wednesday afternoon. So if something have happened between now and the time that this gets published, just know that it's outside of my hands. So without further ado, let's get into it. So, a subservient Iran is not achievable, and that is an objective that the United States had into going into the war. We are able to see this through a lot of open source intelligence. After the capture of Maduro, there were a lot of protests going on in Iran, and once Maduro was taken back to New York for a trial, the United States quickly pivoted its naval resources to the Middle Eastern theater. And it became obvious that the United States was planning something with some regime action. But as the outsiders, we don't know exactly what was being discussed in reference to this. And one of the things that happened in the opening hours of this war is the fall of the former supreme leader. Tactically speaking, it is impressive that the United States and Israel took out the supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, among other senior leadership, in the opening days of the war. In a conventional war, this is supposed to trigger some form of capitulation. But in Iran's case, it did the exact opposite. It rallied a lot of people to the Iranian flag against aggressor states. And you might be asking yourself, well, wouldn't the protesters have been happy that this happened? And the short answer is no. And this has to humor some regime logic. Decades of sanctions and diplomatic isolation strangles the Iranian economy and political space. It institutionalized a deep generational hatred for the US and Israel instead of a sympathy towards the US and Israel. Because as generations change, a lot of institutional education and news media conditions the average civilian into uh, basically blaming all of the regime's problems on outside actors. And we are able to see this with Cuba and Venezuela, where they point to American sanctions to the degradation of conditions in those countries. The same can be seen in North Korea and Russia, where North Korea argues that the diplomatic and political isolation of North Korea is the reason why they are struggling. You're seeing this in Russia, where over a decade ago there were a lot of reports of Putin's regime cracking down on LGBT groups and peoples. And the regime simply pointed this to Western quote unquote rot. So there's a lot of propaganda that has been going on and a bit of truth where the Iranian people and government feel that they are isolated and cornered. So, in other words, once the United States and Israel started attacking Iran, there was no diplomatic off ramp that could have changed the minds of Iranians. Thus, the Iranian nation adopted a nothing to lose mentality. Killing the top leadership decentralized the command and radicalized the remaining factions, as we have been seeing with a lot of public statements from parliamentary members and IRCG commanders, where this just proves that a Western-leaning government in Tehran became fundamentally unachievable from the onset of the war. And that is something that should be seen with a lot of dictatorships, a lot of regimes. We saw that with Iraq, we saw that with Afghanistan, where despite American intervention and support to the peoples, eventually a anti-American regime propped up because of that continuous hatred for the United States, alongside other issues that the United States either perpetrated, accelerated, or did not address. Thus, once the United States figured out that there was no way in which the new government, whether it was IRCG or civilian led, were going to lean or be more cooperative with the United States, it became kind of a dead end objective and thus failed reason as to why the United States preferred to end the war around this time period. Not only that, but because of Iranians' nothing to lose mentality, America basically raced against the clock, where it became a war of how much Iran is willing to bleed versus how much the United States is willing to spend. An authoritarian regime is able to absorb a lot of physical and economic destruction, whereas a liberal democracy is binded by consumer market stability. And we are able to see this with American behavior, with the polling information as to whether or not they approve of the war on Iran. This is the most unpopular war in American history by a long mile, which is insane because at the time that that poll came out, I forget by who it was. Um, it was the first war that was publicly condemned by the onset. The wars on Iraq and Vietnam, for reference, started off positive and then became negative as a point of reference. There was another race from which Trump in particular was going up against, and that is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve Crisis, where the longevity of American operations was practically tied to the reserves that the United States held. With the energy supply chains under strain, the United States had a literal race against the clock before the reserve capacity of the United States ran out completely, and it threatened immediate economic shock at home. If you don't know what the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is, or the SPR, it basically is America's security, energy security, from which if, say, a major nation went to war against the United States or vice versa, and they happen to hold a considerable amount of oil, the United States does not have to immediately capitulate based on the average voter's condemnation of the war, because there's enough oil to keep supplying the country's industrial base. as well as its consumer needs, such as, cars and stuff like that. It was established, ironically enough, in the 70s because OPEC, or the oil cartel of the world, embargoed the United States from oil because of its support for Israel in its wars against Palestine and other Arab members. And that caused a huge stagflation in the American economy, from which it did not recover from until the early to mid 80s. Ever since then, the United States has steadily built up its strategic reserve. And a notable instance from which the United States used that was from President Biden in 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine. The West led a sanctions regime against Russia. And in order for the United States to balance out its oil prices, it released some of those oil reserves to offset that pain that the United States would have otherwise felt. Trump has depleted the strategic oil reserves to all-time lows. And so that means that not only would have the United States ran out of that reserve by around this time, if not a few days more, it also means now that the United States is volatile to any future energy shocks, right? Say if China decides to invade Taiwan tomorrow, or Russia decides to invade the rest of NATO, or Iran decides to this time be the first attacker in the war, the United States would not be well equipped to absorb that economic shock in terms of the energy market. There are also midterms, right? Again, if this war extended beyond its beyond America's ability to keep the reserves intact or to bring Iran to its heels, obviously Americans would vote against Trump. And at this point, it almost is like a certainty where the GOP is going to get like crapped on no matter what. At least hopefully. There's also a arms munitions deadline from which the United States was going up against. I need to preface this by saying that you should not trust people who give you exact numbers to the specific like munitions and how much the United States has available, simply because that's a national security secret. And if anyone has access to that, they're either traitors or they're just lying to you. So it is exactly unknown just how much was burnt through in this war, but the rapid depletion of American arms directly robs other global theaters like Eastern Europe or the Indo-Pacific of immediate and midterm security assets. And that is one of the things that should be of concern a lot, in particular to our allies. There's an example of this that came out, if I'm not mistaken, in the latter half of April or last month, where the US was forced to draw down and move ATACMS, which are Army tactical missile systems, away from South Korea just to sustain operations in the Middle East and keep defending Israel from Iran. And that public move does two things. It exposes America's global vulnerability because everyone knows that. It can be seen. And secondly, it also signals to allies a level of uncertainty of American commitments. The reason why I point this example out in particular is because South Korea had a tough time trying to buy those ATACMS because China threatened the boycott of certain South Korean goods, and it did follow up on those threats once South Korea bought those ATACMS, which are long-range missile systems that can attack Chinese territory, if you are unaware. And South Korea needs those in a potential war against North Korea. Or if, say, China decides to invade Taiwan and North Korea takes advantage of that to attack South Korea. So moves like that on the weapons front exposes America as a weaker country than what it should be presented as in terms of a threat appearance. And that those are things that cannot really be regained in terms of credibility unless if the United States starts to mass industrialize its weapons production, which is another issue in itself entirely. There is another pain that would have crippled further America's ability to wage war in Iran if it did continue. And that comes in the form of oil and fertilizer shocks to the world. So the war immediately triggered a oil shock, which hit America's vital industrial allies in Europe and East Asia. For reference, Europe and East Asia are, in terms of a percentage to their economic sectors, more industrial countries than the United States, as the United States is a predominantly service economy. As a matter of fact, in terms of a percentage of a population, Mexico is a far more has a far more industrialized workforce than the United States, by about twice over, if I'm not mistaken. So, in particular, there were a lot of attacks on LNG infrastructure and gas infrastructure across the Gulf states, such as the Ras Laffan Industrial City LNG networks. And this just demonstrates that in the immediate and midterm, oil supply and energy infrastructure will not become fully operational until the end of the decade because of how devastating Iranian attacks were across the Middle East. And I am very particular and intentional about me using the word operational. In other words, LNG and gas quantity to the world will not go back up to their pre-war levels until the end of the decade because the infrastructure has to be set up and go online first before that oil can be exported to begin with. And that also has to go with the shipping groups, which have to now be redirected for refueling or for other kinds of maintenance back to the Gulf, restock, and then go back out. So in other words, there's a huge bottleneck issue that is going on in the strait that has to be addressed before oil prices go back down. There's also a ripple effect on global supply chains, as industrial output, as I just mentioned before, and local manufacturing have been severely strained in the immediate term, as far as developing manufacturing hubs go, like the Philippines or Bangladesh. The Philippines was the first country to kind of wave a white flag because of the Iran war. They formally asked the United States to issue them waivers for Russian and Iranian gas. The Philippines issued work holidays. In other words, their work week was shut down by 1 or 2 days. And that obviously destroys their economy and market for the immediate term. So those are things that have to be considered as far as the oil shock goes. In terms of fertilizer strains on India and Africa, the Gulf is responsible for about a third of the world's fertilizer exports. And I forgot to mention this, but the Gulf is also responsible for 1/5 of the world's gas exports. So Iran effectively held hostage 1/5 of the world's supply plus its own, which is insane to think about. Nonetheless, Iran also held hostage the fertilizer exports that the Gulf is responsible for. And because of this, India and various other African nations are facing, at least in the immediate term, acute agricultural and food security crisis, which is again compounded on top of the strain that they already were forced to endure from the effects of the war on Russia and Ukraine, as they are responsible for 25 to 30% of the world's agricultural exports on some specific goods. So India is a stark example of this. In the immediate outset of the war, India was forced to pay 1.5 to 3 times more than the pre-war baseline for essential fertilizer goods, which triggers a massive secondary wave of global food inflation, as again, India is the second most populated nation in the world. And the effects of the fertilizer strain are not going to be felt on the United States and other countries like Argentina yet because of their own fertilizer security reserves. But it nonetheless is going to affect the rest of the world in ways that are probably not going to be seen or relieved until the end of the decade. So again, the global economy felt a blow from which it's not going to fully recover from until the end of the decade. And had the war gone on for longer, the United States would have been responsible for a massive industrial depression and a potential humanitarian catastrophe, which is insane to think about. There's also the operational topic of the strategy of war in itself. And there's a lot of questions and a lot of points that I feel should be made from broad strokes. I'm not going to be talking about the specific like weapon systems that the United States use because that's not my field of expertise. I'm just worried about geopolitics. But there's a massive geopolitical question that the United States, both voter and government worker, have to ask. Was Israel's preemptive strike supposed to mask America's direct role based on American naval movements before the war on Iran, as I just noted to you at the beginning of the video? Or was it a deliberate ploy that would eventually drag the US into a total war? You can't have it both ways. And Israel's role in starting the war, as leaders like Marco Rubio bluntly pointed out in the opening days of the war, has to be condemned. And at the minimum, Americans at the midterms are going to call for a potential decoupling of America's alliance with Israel. And I feel like Israel's credibility beyond the genocide in Gaza and its invasions of southern Lebanon are going to be heartfelt for at least a generation of just a total trans-regional set of wars where Israel kept waging wars with its neighbors. It kept invading land in Palestine, in Syria, and Lebanon, going back and forth with the Houthis, and eventually its full-scale war with Iran. And I feel like that is neglected now because, again, it escalated to a simple war between the giants in the region, being the United States and Iran. But Israel, directly and indirectly, is responsible for attacks basically across the entire Middle East. If you look at the map on the right, virtually every neighbor of Iran has been attacked because Israel started this war, which was unnecessary and did not yield any net objectives to the United States to begin with. Iran attacked embassies in Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, attacked bases in Iraq and Syria to an extent. It attacked Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, Oman, and Israel waged its own war with Lebanon. Iran attacked as far as Cyprus, which is insane. So a total regional war with literally nothing to return, and in fact, we got negative consequences of the war. Tactically, Iranian military capacities have been crippled, but not destroyed. It is quite impressive to say that Iran successfully adapted by scattering its command and control operations across the country and either hiding or recovering its mobile missile infrastructure, of which intelligence reports based from the United States reported that at the minimum, 40% of Iranians' air capacities remained operational, which is insane to think about. When you assume that the United States would have been a far more technological, stronger military capable of wiping out Iran's capacities. And that is also another goal or objective that the United States claimed to have at the beginning of the war, degrading Iranians' missile capacities. Another failed objective. This is another failure which arose because of the war, being that the U.S. Navy was unable to break Iran's blockade, being a formidable U.S. Navy at that hand. And it was unable to break Iran's asymmetric blockade of the shipping lanes. Even if Iran did not attack the ships too much, its psychological capacity and the deployment of landmines scared away the insurance companies from even like attempting to break the strait. And in fact, Iran was able to toll certain ships that were crossing the strait, and that in itself briefly broke American hegemonic dominance of the freedom of navigation. And the fact that the US did not really do anything at the operational level to break the blockade also demonstrates a massive failure in American leadership. There's another wild card objective that the United States claimed was the central reason for going to war with Iran. And I'm going to be talking about this much more towards the end of the video, but the fate of Iranian nuclear infrastructure and material is unknown. Again, we attacked them exactly last year to destroy its nuclear infrastructure. We attacked it again, and we have not been able to recover or even, know if Iranian nuclear capacities have actually been like crippled or offline. And that is something that the United States has to be concerned with. So now we talk about Israeli capacities again, and it demonstrates that Israel's security apparatus can only focus on one major enemy at a time, which is again part of the reason why Israel steadily escalated across the last 3 years. Again, they started with Palestine, then they went with Lebanon for a bit, then they went to Syria and back to Lebanon, then they went to the Houthis, and then they started escalating with Iran steadily. Um, So with Iran's defense capabilities successfully tying Hezbollah's survival to its own, Israel was forced to shift focus to its northern border, and that creates a dilemma in Washington, where the U.S. is forced to strictly micromanage and control Israel to keep the peace. But it also makes it difficult because Israel, as I just mentioned, is prone to breaking a lot of sustainable commitments, as it has with Palestine, Lebanon, and now Iran. And that's going to be a massive point of concern for literally everyone who is viewing this and does not want the war to continue. Um, Israel being the massive wild card here, which is, again, concerning. Again, at the operational level, for the United States to basically survive in a new kind of condition of warfare, America needs to radically pivot its doctrine towards incorporating drones in the battlefield. It also has to modernize its bases. Again, the fact that Iran, a subpar country, was able to destroy many American bases beyond habitation and even injure Americans, and in that case, kill over a dozen Americans, uh, should be worthy of embarrassment and should be called out. It also demonstrates that costly aerial and naval operations are unsustainable. And if Iran was able to humiliate America on such a scale, then we really need to start discussing whether or not, from an economic perspective, it makes sense to maintain America's like large military presence in the Middle East. So now we get to the fun part, to the last section, right? Will the peace last? There are immediate flashpoints that could reignite the war within months. Again, the nuclear issue has been kicked to the next 2 months, which is when the memorandum of understanding has to be improved to its next step in the negotiation process. The Iranian nuclear issue, again, being the much more important one, needs to be settled and determined, however that goes. Lebanon's sovereignty remains highly fragile and incredibly tense. And in order for Iran to not attack Israel, Israel needs to keep its hands off of Lebanon, and that includes respecting Lebanon's borders, which has not been the case in a while. It is unclear if government control of Iran will remain at the civilian administration as it did before the war, or if there will be tension between the civilian and military arm. And that matters a lot because we need to know who our enemy is, or who America's enemy is. I say our, like I started this war. Bro, I did not start this war, and I would never have started a dumbass war like this. But anyways, I digress. If a military arm effectively runs the country, then there is a stronger inclination towards keeping the war going or keeping hostile relations with the United States and Israel. If a civilian administration keeps control of Iran, there might be a path to peace or further negotiations. And as it stands, it's unclear who the United States is really dealing with. And that should be something that the United States and Israel need to observe over the next few months. There's also Israel's internal power struggle, which should be something that needs to be discussed. There are crucial elections looming in October. Again, Netanyahu is running, and there are two sets of issues from which Netanyahu might be out of power, being Netanyahu's corruption scandal, and again, Netanyahu's perception of being seen as the security guarantor of Israel. And if Netanyahu sees that he did not gain anything from the war on Iran, he will look weak. And we need to see what Netanyahu's behavior is in the next months, and if he wants to stay in power or not. And if so, whether or not he is much more likely to restart war. However, to give a bit of a hope pill, there are some structural walls that the United States and Iran have hit that limit the continuance of war. Just because Iran was willing to bleed more than the United States was willing to spend, does not mean that Iran has an infinite amount of blood. Domestic strains have been mounting. There's a lot of damage on the water infrastructure. There is a lot of damage on the economy. Iranian rial, which is their currency, is worth less than that of a USD penny, which is insane. There's also a lack of basic administration, and that has to obviously improve to keep the country from becoming a failed state. An American invasion of Iran is out of the question if Trump does decide to re-escalate or escalate into a total war. It is likely that there will be some protests erupting in the United States, which would disallow the United States from continuing war against Iran. Both governments are also reeling from their losses. Again, America has a much more symbolic and political one, whereas Iran has a much more literal one. The decapitation of senior leadership does mean that Iran has to reestablish that chain of command and, again, focus on modernizing its infrastructure and doing other things that keep Iran a formidable enemy, such as replenishing its stockpile. And the same could be said of the United States, where it burned through all of its munition or a lot of its munitions, at least relative to its positions in East Asia and Eastern Europe. So, with that said, the war seems to be stopping because, again, the United States and Iran have hit a lot of limits that, if unbounded, would otherwise lead to total war, which is what neither side is willing to risk. And both governments are fundamentally reeling from exhaustion because of that. Stopping now allows both countries to retreat, spin the narrative according to them, and claim victory. But at the same time, it does leave a lot of unanswered issues that I just discussed. And because of that, I guess I should end the video by saying that there should be a lot of cautious optimism about the ending of hostilities. I will try to cover this as much as possible, either in my publications or on my Instagram or whatever. But let me know, what do you think are the reasons why the United States and Iran chose to stop the war? What lessons could you draw from the war? Do you think I am correct? Do you think I'm incorrect in some areas? Is there anything that you would like me to discuss at further length? Please let me know in the comment section below. Like and subscribe, or just like if you want to keep up with the engagement. I thank you all very much for sitting through this, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.